Great rising, grasshoppers. I hope everybody is still safe and healthy at the house. My name is Ma'ati Tanetter, and I am a social studies teacher at Denton Magnet School of Technology. Now today, we are going to start a brand new chapter on the Vietnam War years. Now, before we get into that, you may have wondered, well, why do we need social studies? I understand why we need math, because we got to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. I understand why we need language arts and reading, because we have to know how to read and write. And I even understand why we have science, because we do need to have a working knowledge about our environment. Why social studies? This is why. The events that happened in the past impact us to this very day. So a simple answer would be this. We study the past to explain the present, to hopefully make a plan for the future. That is the reason why we do study history, like United States history. And because we are all citizens, you should have a working knowledge about the history of our country. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, if you have the hard copy packet, make sure that you have the one that says the Vietnam War years, at the top of the page for section 1. Now, as I had said in weeks prior to today, if you want to just go ahead and listen, that's fine too, because you can catch the same lesson a few hours later on the MCPSS TV YouTube channel. If you want to go ahead and annotate as I go along, you can do that too. Make sure you have a pen or a highlighter. All right. Now, the two standards that we're going to be covering today are number 8, describe how the United States' role in the Cold War influenced domestic and international events, and number 9, critique major social and cultural changes in the United States since World War II. Now, in U.S. history, the term domestic means anything existing or occurring inside a particular country. So anything inside the country, that's domestic. International refers to anything existing or occurring in multiple nations. What's this Cold War? Now, if you remember earlier in this semester, the Cold War began right after World War II, and the main enemies were the United States and the Soviet Union, better known as Russia, or at the time, the USSR. Now, the Cold War got its name because both sides were afraid of actual combat against each other. So it was more or less like, well, we got stuff over here. We got weapons over here. Well, so do we. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? It's sort of like a wolfing contest. All right. Before we jump into this section, here's our bell ringer. If you were there, you are a student in 1960. Whenever you discuss current events in a class, students talk nervously about the ongoing nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. If Cold War tensions ever spark an all-out nuclear war, entire cities and populations could be destroyed in just a matter of minutes. Do you think Cold War tensions will lead to a nuclear war? I'll give you a second for your dendrites to start popping this early in the morning. All right, now at this time in our history, the United States and Russia, they were engaged in this rivalry to see who was top dog in terms of world leadership. And this was a serious concern for the United States, and when I show you the map, you'll see why. All right, our key terms. The first one is Peace Corps, and it's a program that sent volunteers to developing countries to help with projects such as digging wells and building schools. Fidel Castro, Cuban rebel leader who led a revolution and established a communist government. Berlin Wall, Cold War barrier that separated the city of Berlin, Germany, into two parts. Cuban Missile Crisis, attempt by Soviet Union to send nuclear missiles to Cuba, followed by American blockade. Neil Armstrong, American astronaut, the first man to walk on the moon. All right, our second set of key terms. Edwin Buzz Aldrin, crewmate of Neil Armstrong, second man to walk on the moon. Ho Chi Minh, leader of communist revolution against the French in Vietnam. Domino theory, concerned that if one nation became communist, nearby nations would follow. And Viet Cong, guerrilla fighters opposed to the South Vietnamese government. All right, our essential question, in what ways did the United States confront communist nations in Cold War conflicts around the world? Now, there's this saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, in our history, we've always had these things called political cartoons, and this is an example of one. Now, a political cartoon, well, it's a cartoon that makes a point about a political issue or an event. And you can find them in daily newspapers, or you can go online and Google them to see all kinds of cartoons. And a good political cartoon will make you think about current events, but it also tries to sway your opinion toward what the cartoonist is trying to say. Now, in this particular cartoon, the United States is represented by Uncle Sam, he's in the red, white, and blue, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, also known as Russia, is represented as a bear. Now, if you look at this cartoon, they're both on a seesaw, and that represents the delicate balance of power, world power, between the two countries. So they're seesawing on a globe. Here's a fun fact. The name Uncle Sam is linked to this actual man by the name of Samuel Wilson. And he was a meat packer in Troy, New York at the time. Now, what he would do is he would send meat in these barrels to the soldiers during the War of 1812. And he would stamp U.S. on the barrels. Well, the soldiers, they kind of looked at it and they nicknamed the barrels, well, that's from Uncle Sam. And it kind of stuck. And so 200 plus years later, whenever you hear people saying Uncle Sam, or that's from Uncle Sam, or I work for Uncle Sam, that's a reference to the United States federal government. So there's your fun fact for the day. Now, the character Uncle Sam that we can see was drawn by this artist by the name of Thomas Nast. So fun fact for today, that's where Uncle Sam came from. All right. One of the first ways that Kennedy confronts communism was to maintain strong military forces and expand the nation's supply of nuclear weapons. And he tried to also do this by doing non-military programs such as the Peace Corps. We had said that that was a program where volunteers would go into these underdeveloped countries and set up schools, dig water sources, and things like that. Now, there's this one program called the Alliance for Progress. The United States pledged $20 billion in aid to countries in Latin America, like in Central and South America. Now, the idea was to try to influence these countries to adapt a democratic government. Unfortunately, this assistance did little to improve conditions in Latin America or the relations. So it was put in place, but it did not do what it was meant to do. So what ended up happening was this. In places like Cuba in 1959, Fidel Castro created a communist government. Castro's close ties with the Soviet Union worried Kennedy because Cuba is about 90 miles away from Miami, Florida. Now, on April 17th, there was this thing that happened that is called the Bay of Pigs. The CIA began training Cuban exiles to invade the island. And this is kind of personal to me because my father, God rest his soul, was a 17-year-old in the Navy at the time, and he was involved in this. So on April 17th, about 1,500 Cuban exiles landed by boat at Cuba's Bay of Pigs. And it was kind of ugly. It was an unsuccessful attempt. Castro's forces quickly responded, and about 300 of the invaders were captured or killed. It was just kind of an ugly scene. It really was. So that particular program, if you want to call it that, that was put in place to try to stop the spread of communism was a disaster. Now, as I had said before, I'm going to show you this map so that you can see why there was a concern on, they're kind of close. If you look at your map, and all maps have a legend or they have a map key. This one is no different. Let's put these map skills to work. If you look, all of the rocket ships that you see on Cuba, on the island of Cuba, are Soviet missile sites. If you look north of Cuba, there's Miami, less than 100 miles away. Now, if we use the map scale, which is what we use to try to estimate the mileage between one point to another, we can see that it's very, very close. And that was why President Kennedy was concerned about the communist government in Cuba at the time. So what did he do? The Soviet Union had threatened to take over West Berlin in 1961. But let me back up just a little bit because we need a little bit of context on how did this come about? Right after World War II, the separation of Berlin began in 1945 after the collapse of Germany. If you remember, Germany was one of the Axis powers and they had lost in the war. The country was divided into 4 zones where each superpower controlled a zone. And in 1946, the reparation agreements broke down the Soviet and the Western zones. The Soviet Union were kind of like, I'm not liking this. And this led to a division of this particular city. Response to the West was to merge the French, the British, and the American zones a year later. So we've got the French, the British, and the Americans in one particular zone, and we have the Soviet Union in another. Now, a lot of people in that particular area, they were like, it seems like things are going to be a little bit better in West Germany as opposed to East Germany, so I'm going to go and move over there. So between 1949 and 1961, a lot of people were moving from the East to the West. That is why the Berlin Wall was put up, to keep people from going from east to west and vice versa. So the wall stood as a symbol of the Cold War for about 3 decades. It came down in 1991, actually. So in 1961, we have this wall. Now, what ended up happening was this. In October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis started happening at that particular time. Kennedy did not want to fight the Soviet Union. Now, these 2 leaders in this picture, we have Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy. American spy planes discovered that the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the U.S. Navy, they formed this thing called a blockade around Cuba to prevent Soviet ships from bringing more weapons. The Soviet ships turned back, and Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the nuclear missiles from Cuba. Now, in return, Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba. Now, this turned into this thing called this Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And between the 2 leaders, they established this telephone called a hotline so that the leaders could talk directly to each other at a moment's notice. So again, Kennedy was committed to stopping the spread of communism. And one of the ways they did that was to establish communication between the 2 leaders. Now, although Kennedy and Khrushchev, they had taken some steps to improve the relationships and to prevent conflicts, the Cold War continued, and it continued in space. Now, one aspect of the Cold War that heated up was the space race. And this is when we have NASA being created. And NASA stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It was founded under President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration in 1958. So in 1961, The Soviet Union sent the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. Well, once the United States found that out, they were like, well, we got to get on board. We got to send somebody up there too. So there was this rivalry between the United States and Russia. So in May of 1961, Alan Shepard made the first American space flight. He had not landed on the moon, he just made the flight. It was about maybe a year later when John Glenn had orbited the Earth. And about 7, 8 years later, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, they became the first people to actually walk on the moon. So the countries were competing against each other to show the world who truly is the most powerful nation on the earth. So people were looking at this on TV in 1969. Back on Earth, still having some issues with controlling the spread of communism. So during World War II, Japan had driven the French out of Indochina because at this particular time, the French had claimed this as a colony of France. Well, now when Japan was defeated by the Allies in 1945, then Vietnam wanted its own independence. Well, the French and the Vietnamese were still fighting, and they had fought until about 1954. We have this thing called the Geneva Accords, where they temporarily split Vietnam into North and South. The compromise called for democratic elections in July of 1956, and hopefully that would unite this country under one nation, but that's not what happened, unfortunately. So we have North Vietnam becoming a communist dictatorship under the leader Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam had a Western-style government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. And the United States threw their support behind South Vietnam. And what they were hoping is under this particular leadership, they could influence the whole country to become democratic. That didn't happen. And Diem, according to our text, was doing some things that the United States didn't necessarily like. And what he had done was this thing called nepotism. And what that means is when you are a person in power and you put your own family members into government positions that they may or may not necessarily be qualified for. And people were not happy with that. So this went on along with some other things that weren't all that kosher. But when Diem canceled the elections in South Vietnam, that's when people were like, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to be voting? And you're going to cancel elections because you're losing some support? That's not going to work. So what ended up happening was this. The United States actually backed the decision of the South Vietnamese leader. Again, people were like, no, this is not working. This is not going to fly. So in 1960, members of this group called the National Liberation Front, and they were North Vietnamese members, they had recruited people in South Vietnam that were opposed to the leader in South Vietnam to fight against the South Vietnam government. So it's a kind of like a quagmire. People are just kind of choosing sides and things like that. The South Vietnam leader knew that he was losing support, and people in the South were helping people in the North, and things just kind of came to a head in November of 1963. A group of South Vietnamese army leaders had seized power and assassinated Diem. And that, for the most part, was the kickoff to the Vietnam War. Coincidentally, in November of 1963, that was also the same time where President Kennedy was assassinated. So in summary, President Kennedy confronted communist threats around the world. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to send a person to the moon. And the Cold War conflict in Vietnam led the United States into war. One thing that I may have mentioned in weeks past, you are in the middle of history right now. So if you can, be sure to talk to some of your older relatives and ask them what major events were happening when they were your age. And if they allow you to, record it on your smartphone. Do not put it on social media without your parents' permission. But if you do that, then you are recording history so that when you are a grandparent, you can pass this down to your grandchildren. So if you are able to do that, if you're able to start a journal of some sort to record things that are happening right now, I encourage you to do that because we are living history as we speak. So next week, we're going to get more into the escalation in Vietnam, which is section 2 in chapter 14. Remember, we study history to learn from the past, to explain the present, and to prepare for the future. Please stay safe, grasshoppers, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.